Yeah, I'm not going to do that, don't worry. So the theme for Wholesome Halloween this year, as I've already mentioned during this video essay marathon, is a celebration of horror. And let's be real here, we can't have a celebration of horror without a look at one of, if not possibly even the most significant horror film to ever exist. To exclude Nosferatu out of the picture is like not inviting your granddad to his own birthday party. Just seems like a cruel oversight. A loose and unofficial adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, this is a movie that this year turns 101 years old. Gotta pay my respects to the elders here. And this film is old enough to be its own legendary vampiric monster at this point. Once you hit those triple-digit numbers, it starts to sound cool when you announce your age, and you're definitely getting into potential vampire territory. Especially when you age as gracefully as Nosferatu. This one's going to be a bit of a horror film history lesson, because it's important to note that horror has a rich history in this medium, and a lot of that richness begins with this very movie. That's not to say it was the first horror film. Not at all. The incredible history of this genre goes way back. In fact, Nosferatu was beaten to the punch by at least a whole quarter of a century, as arguably the honour of first horror movie is thought to go to the French 1886, possibly early 1887 short film Le Manoir du Diable, or The House of the Devil, as it's sometimes called in English. Which, by the way, if you want to absorb that little bit of film history so you can seem cultured and smart and be insufferable about it to your friends, and you know you do, it exists in full on both YouTube and its own Wikipedia page, and it's only like a few minutes long. You can see the whole thing in less than the time it takes to watch most TikToks now. Some of it even holds up as being kinda cool. The bat turning back into a dude when another character tries to grab it is done so with a performer movement that genuinely sells the cut really well. If you want to be especially wanky, and again, you know you do, you can even treat yourself to the very first horror remake, as the director revisited and remade the film with hand colouring only a year later in Le Château Haunt. Yep, even in the 1800s we were remaking horror movies. Guess no one has original ideas anymore, eh? Just can't escape remakes, can you? At only 45 seconds long, there's no bat in this one though, but since the first version did have that transformation, that arguably makes it not just the first horror movie, but the first vampire movie too, even though I'm pretty sure the Batman here is supposed to be the devil and not a vampire. If you do go down this interpretation though, Nosferatu isn't even the first horror film to feature the classic creature. It's also not even the first horror feature film. That title goes to the Italian effort L'Inferno, an adaptation of the first canticle of Dante's Inferno that clocks in at 71 minutes, which came out in 1911. That movie is a rad visual spectacle, by the way. There's some really crazy effects work for the time, including a scene where a giant Satan eats someone whole in a manner reminiscent of the incredible Francisco Goya painting Saturn Devouring His Son, which is a wild visual to put in motion for audiences of the 1910s. And hell, Nosferatu isn't even the first horror to adapt Dracula, with one, possibly even two films to bring the big D to life releasing prior. The potential first film was a Russian effort just called Dracula that allegedly released in 1920, however no concrete evidence of its existence has ever been found. One we do know is for real though is the Hungarian 1921 movie Dracula Halala, or Dracula's Death. However, this film is also considered lost to time, with only 4 publicity photographs and a novel adaptation having survived to prove its existence. Which means that while Nosferatu isn't the first Dracula adaptation in cinema, it at the very least seemingly is the oldest surviving one, and marks the earliest instance of the character in action that anyone alive today may see. Which coincidentally is kind of a miracle actually. As I mentioned before, the film is a unofficial adaptation of Dracula, and while there is a lot of stuff changed from the novel, from key scenes to all the characters' names, boy were the heirs to Bram Stoker's estate still not happy about it, suing over the film's existence, with the court ruling ordering that any and all copies of Nosferatu should be destroyed. In hindsight, maybe they shouldn't have told on themselves and put "from the novel Dracula" at the start of the movie. Now, as you might have guessed from this video, clearly that order of mass destruction didn't bloody happen. Thanks in no small part to piracy, by the way, making it so that many unknown copies remained in circulation. And thank God, right? Or else we might not have one of the most formative and important pieces of horror fiction in any medium ever. But what makes Nosferatu so special? Why talk about this more than any of those other mentioned movies as being so crucial to the history of the genre when they all came before it? Well, to truly explain that, I'm going to need to give you some context of the time. You see, what you have to understand with Nosferatu is that it genuinely set the template for what a horror movie was for all of cinema after that point, and that's not hyperbole. Almost everything we understand a horror movie to be, right up to modern examples, all of the atmosphere, tension, all of the visual language and associated imagery, it can all in some way be traced back to this film. Yes, there were things that preceded it, but before Nosferatu came along, the idea of horror films is kind of hard to pin down. I said that Le Manoir du Diable was arguably the first horror film, and that, arguably, comes from the fact that it is purely a horror film by accident. Though the imagery features iconography we now associate with horror through its use of bats, skeletons and the devil, it was intended by its director, illusionist and special effects pioneer Georges Méliès, as a technical showcase, one meant to delight and humour with its usage of substitution splices for visual gags and trickery, rather than meant to elicit fear. And this would be the pattern for a while. His remake the following year was much meant to be interpreted in the same way. His next horror title, 1896's A Terrible Night, in which a man wrestles a giant spider, no thank you, was also meant as a horror comedy. There were possibly some legitimate attempts by him to create what we now think of as horror around this period, such as his 1889 title The Cave of Demons, but this film is now lost, so it's hard to say for sure. Similarly, the short film Photographing a Ghost by George Albert Smith from its synopsis could have been an early sincere attempt at the horror genre, but tragically this is also lost to time. Around this time, it's just really hard to pin down what horror even was in cinema. It didn't have a real identity. If we define horror not by its use of imagery, but by its emotional intent, then it could be argued that the first known film to use special effects, an 1895 short called The Execution of Mary Stuart, for its intent to shock with its depiction of a beheading, is a horror movie, but it's literally just an 18-second clip of a faked execution. Maybe we should call Méliès's 1901 9-minute adaptation of the fairy tale Bluebeard the first horror film for its trickster imp character and its reveal of hanging corpses. But it still has none of the kind of visual identity of horror yet. The film is still performed as a kind of wide-shot pantomime-like stage play, and Méliès is still focused on the special effects showcase of the likes of transparent ghosts, shrinking and growing keys, and the illusion of a sword stabbing, rather than on the intent to engage with matters of the morbid or to scare. What we generally find from around this time period is less horror films and more films that use horror iconography. And even when the goal was to scare or evoke the kind of emotions we now associate with the genre, it was still done in a way totally dissimilar to what horror films would become. Going back to the aforementioned L'Inferno, there is a definite intent to evoke shock and horror with its intense fantastical violence and scary visuals. But the film plays out more like a picture book. The imagery of the film again shot in this kind of constant way that characterised a lot of movies of the period, and the narrative not really focusing on individual characterisation, but rather on the sequence of events. The text that displays throughout the movie acting as an omnipresent narrator explaining the visuals you are seeing rather than giving a voice to any individual on screen. A person might speak in the movie and rather than reading his dialogue will instead read something like, "The poet inquires as to whether any other Florentinas are punished in the Inferno." Everything is communicated through this kind of third-hand account. There's a sense of detachment from the story that is unfolding that keeps the audience at an arm's length, in a way that would seem strange now. There were other horror films here and there, an adaptation of Frankenstein, plenty of takes on Jekyll and Hyde would surface, but it wasn't until Robert Wine's The Cabinet of Dr Caligari in 1920 that we get what felt like the first real horror film. Like a full, narrative, character-focused feature that told us and invited us into a story rather than just presented us with one. A film that used close-ups and the performances of its actors to communicate fear, that used makeup and stylistic set design and light and shadow to sell mood and atmosphere, that dealt with morbid subject matter and presented on-screen violence through creative visuals. It was the first to bring all the elements together to make a real, out-and-out horror production. And honestly, this video could kinda absolutely be on this movie, Caligari and Nosferatu were like the 1-2 punch in basically inventing the genre, and are equally as important as one another. The only reason I've elected to cover Nosferatu rather than Caligari is simply because while both are important first milestones in horror cinema, equally as worthy of celebration, Nosferatu did what Caligari did prior in bringing all these elements together for a moody piece of filmmaking, but I'd argue it did it in a slightly more accessible manner, that's more in line with the genre as we understand and know it today. Both movies are two of the most canonical films in the movement of German expressionist cinema, German expressionism being an early 20th century art movement that focused on anti-realism stylings, using distortions of reality to emphasize the subjective experience of an artist, or in film's case, characters' perspectives. A modern example of this can be found in the work of someone like Tim Burton, with the strange, exaggerated realities of his stop-motion designs or the overly gothic architecture of his Batman movies. But where Caligari really rolls into this aesthetic with surreal visuals and style that creates this twisted world of slanted buildings, stretchy, labyrinthine and impossible architecture, exaggerated makeup that creates people who feel otherworldly or caricatures of individuals rather than real beings, Nosferatu, on the other hand, is a little bit more subdued in its approach, at least comparatively, and feels less arthouse as a result. That's not to say Caligari is worse for these stylistic choices, they're what make the film so amazing, but I just think that speaking specifically about what developed the modern notion of horror films, I think we see a little bit more of that DNA in Nosferatu due to its less surreal approach to its visuals. And I am also just a little bit more familiar with that movie than I am Caligari, though honestly the topic of this video between these two movies could have been decided by a coin flip if I really wanted. They're both great granddads, and both should be invited to the birthday party. So that's the historical context of the film's importance, but what about the film itself? It's all well and good saying something is important just because it is, but let's look at exactly how it informs our modern perception of horror rather than just saying that it does. Directed by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, Nosferatu, as I've already stated, is an adaptation of Dracula, so you probably know the story already, albeit it does have a fair few changes. The core characters are the same, just with different names in this outing. A lot of people think that was due to Murnau and team trying to cover their asses for copyright, but considering they literally credit Dracula as the source material in the opening credits, it's far more likely this was just to localize it better for a German audience. So Dracula is changed to Orlok, his servant Renfield became Nock, Jonathan Hawkins became Thomas Hutter, Mina and also kind of Lucy became condensed into a singular character called Ellen, etc. But it didn't just stop with name switch outs. Other changes include a good chunk of mythology around the character being absent. Orlok just kills his victims in this telling rather than changing them. And there's no brides of Dracula in this version. He never transforms into a bat or a wolf, nor does he de-age or look at all like how Dracula would be described. There's no spiel about him having no reflection, no Christian religious iconography like crosses are used against him. There's no Van Helsing, which is pretty interesting as that character is heavily implied to be German, and this version of the story switches the setting from England to Germany, yet they got rid of the only potential German character. There's an extra scene here and there made up for the film, like the Renfield stand-in being chased by townsfolk, and the ending is pretty drastically different, with Orlok eventually falling victim to sunlight. A part of vampiric lore that's a long-standing myth within pop culture now, but back then was seemingly made up specifically for this film, as in the novel, the OG Big D was only weakened by sunlight, not slayed by it. Other than that, it hits the same general core beats you'll be familiar with from the book and a lot of adaptations. Hutter, this film's Harker, travels to Transylvania to meet a mysterious new client named Count Orlok and to sell him a property back home in Germany. He stays with Orlok for a bit in a magnificent and creepy gothic castle. While there, he accidentally cuts his thumb, and his host is like super totally chill about that and most definitely doesn't start to suck the blood out of it like a weird little freak. We deviate a little bit from the book plot at this point, with Hutter staying in Transylvania for a bit and not falling ill and delirious in Budapest after an encounter with the vampiric brides, but instead he reads a book he found at the local inn that describes the vampire myth and starts to suspect his host is potentially this supernatural creature. Orlok continues to be a creepy bugger, mentioning to Hutter after seeing a picture of his wife Ellen that she has a lovely neck, and after signing the documents for the property, travels to Germany by ship, much as he does to England in the novel, with a bunch of coffins full of rats and dirt, and during the journey, all of the crew mysteriously die. Couldn't have anything to do with the creepy man who came on board with the rat coffins, of course. Nah. Don't be silly. Orlok's departure causes concern for Hutter, who rushes home and upon arrival finds that Orlok has brought death to his German town, possibly in the form of a plague carried by the rats he brought with him. And as the bodies pile up, eventually Hutter's wife Ellen, on the advice of the vampire book which suggests this is a way to defeat the creature, willingly offers her blood to Orlok, who is so busy munching on her neck he loses track of time and is destroyed by the sun, just in time for Hutter to have one last embrace with his wife before she dies from blood loss in his arms. You can see, if you're familiar with the source material or any other adaptations, where the film kind of weaves in and out of that plot. The general sense of progression is the same, we kind of hit the same core beats more or less, but sometimes it's just the ways in which we go about getting there that's a little bit different, or maybe takes a bit of a detour. It's not the film's plot though that is this movie's great contribution to cinema, it is its execution. Dracula was already a hugely important novel by the time of this movie adaptation. But what that story didn't have was visuals. In adapting the story, Murnau creates a vivid gothic world of shadows and monsters that sets up all of horror cinema that follows. He, and actor Max Schreck, who plays Orlok, treat this creature with a kind of terrifying reverence, leaning into the expressionist movement to create a character that feels stiff and inhuman. A character who only blinks once in the entire film, but otherwise only engages with others and the audience in a wide-eyed, inhuman stare. A character with gangly limbs who is constantly framed in sharp, angular and unnaturally crooked poses. There's a clear intent to make this character evoke a sense of dread, not just in the way he looks, but in the way he moves, like a lurking threat in the dark. There's moments in this film that even to this day, over 100 years later, still have this haunting quality to them, like the iconic shadow ascending the stairs, the stark contrast of a dark figure on a light wall painting a terrifyingly dangerous looking giant and threatening silhouette, or the scene in which Orlok skulks into Hutter's room at night, cuts from the camera making him seem to jump closer each time we're made to look away, his impossibly large stature being framed perfectly by the door as he enters, giving him entire focus of the frame, his eyes slowly angling down towards Hutter with a slow and deliberate curiosity, as Hutter has nowhere to go and can only look away and hide in abject fear. A scene that is no doubt the precursor to every hold your breath and hide moment of tension as the killer stalks closer to the protagonist's hiding spot in all of the horror films that followed. We see this imagery forming for the very first time here. The film is inventing the language of horror films as it plays out. From gothic visuals to creepy prosthetics to shadows and darkness to close-ups of afraid faces. So much striking cinematography from this thing is about framing a monster coming from the darkness. When he emerges from the ship's interior, when he gazes almost towards the audience from the darkness behind a window, when his shadow crawls up the wall over a potential victim, when he lurches bolt upright in an inhuman manner from his coffin. It's all forming the language with which artists would use to create tension and fear for literally the next century of motion pictures. The cinematography in this film is striking, pulled off in such a manner as to allow the cast the ability to sell how afraid they are, or in the case of Schreck, how menacing they can be. And this fear and dread around this character is all tied together in a genuinely moody and atmospheric piece of cinema. One filled with the imagery of gothic castles, of rats and dirt, of towns filled with death and misery, and of expressive, terrified faces. This and Caligari represent the birth of atmosphere in horror movies, of a tone in cinema that had not existed in this capacity prior. The telling of a spooky story not just through plot content and depictions of shocking imagery or special effects, but smart, stylistic storytelling with an artistic vision to communicate those ideas. And it is these masterpieces, first occurrences of these elements, that literally crafted the foundations of the entire genre. Unfortunately, I must say though, as much as I think Nosferatu is an important piece of cinema, I'd be remiss to celebrate it unconditionally and not acknowledge some of its problematic elements. Now, this is a little complex a discussion, but the film relies heavily on the fear of otherness, and the way in which it depicts this otherness is arguably with anti-Semitism. Orlok's design is highly reminiscent of the way Jewish people were depicted in stereotypical caricatures. He has features reminiscent of rats, which the Jewish population were often compared with. The plot revolves around Orlok's desire to acquire property in small German towns, which draws parallels to the idea of a Jewish home invasion of the German homeland at a time when anti-Semitic sentiments were rising through northern Europe. The way in which Orlok spreads the plague arguably perpetuates the idea of the Jewish invader as an agent of death and disease as well. Where this discussion gets complicated, however, is that some of these elements, such as the rich and unusual count acquiring property from another land, are artifacts of the original novel, and of the elements that are not carried over from the book, such as Orlok's appearance, it is debatable as to how much of this was carried out with purposeful intent. Academics have noted that Murnau was himself a gay man, and as such would likely have found himself persecuted by these same ideologies that spread anti-Semitic sentiment. And he was friends with and protective of many Jewish men and women. Now, I know the line, "I'm not an anti-Semite, I have Jewish friends," these days carries as much weight as the sentiment of, "I'm not a serial killer, I have friends who are alive." But this was not a claim Murnau himself was using to defend his output, but rather an observation others have made about him at a time when that was in fact a more unusual thing. There's also the matter of one of those Jewish friends he had, actor Alexander Grenache, appearing in the film as the fairly major character Nock, which makes the discussion around the film and its arguably problematic content even more difficult to navigate without speaking for an actual Jewish voice who appeared within it. If I had to guess, and I must state this is purely conjecture on my part, I would say that what is likely to have happened is that these anti-Semitic parallels were absolutely not presented with any malicious intent, and there was no conscious decision to demonize a group on the part of Murnau or any of the creative team. However, I think it's possible that the sentiment of anti-Semitism was growing so rapidly in this country at this time that Murnau would no doubt have been exposed to constant imagery of otherness through these stereotypes that formed a visual identity of what people were afraid of at the time. And so prevalent were these concepts within these societies that it's possible Nosferatu could have unintentionally incorporated these harmful images sheerly on a subconscious level from exposure to these ideas. I don't think the film is by any means something like Birth of a Nation and actively out to spread hate, but I certainly think it's possible that it accidentally played into some harmful fears of a bigoted ideology, and regardless of its place in cinema history and its importance in birthing a genre I am deeply passionate about, it's always important we engage with these possibilities critically, not so we can cancel Nosferatu or whatever, but so we better understand the material we are engaging with and can learn from its missteps. That said, if you can get past that, and it is totally fine if you cannot, this film is a super important part of horror history and can be found pretty much everywhere. Most copies of this thing are in the public domain, so it's available in its entirety for free on a bunch of services, including the very thing you are watching me on right now. Due to its age as well as the heavily pirated nature of the film being what kept its existence going, there's a fair few varied versions out there. For a long time, the one that most people were seeing was a sped up bootleg that gave all the characters their original novel names in the credits, so if you find one where Orlok is called Dracula, you know that's probably not the one you want to watch. Other various restorations exist here and there, some of which have different levels of copyright on them due to the work put in for the restorative efforts. Some versions of the film are purely black and white, which to be honest is the way I like to watch it because that's how I first saw it. But actually a more true to the original print way to view it would be with the film's tints incorporated. This was done as a style to better communicate different aesthetics and times within the movie. So shots like this image on a boat here, for example, in black and white looks like it could be a daytime image, but the proper version of the film had this blue tint here to communicate it was actually a nighttime shot. With the tints is a perfectly valid way to watch the movie, of course. It'll also give you some nice sepia tones, some moody reds and pinks, some atmospheric greeny blues, and arguably it's the more correct way to watch it, but I just personally vibe with the stark contrast of the pure black and white. If you do choose to watch it, maybe just do a little research beforehand to find which version you'd prefer. Ultimately though, however you choose to engage with it, you'll still be witness to a truly monumentally historic moment in horror. There's a reason we're still talking about this film over 100 years later. A reason why this illegal bootleg of an adaptation has in itself been remade by critically acclaimed filmmakers like Werner Herzog, and apparently, if it comes to fruition, also now Robert Eggers. There's a reason why its impact can be felt and seen in so much vampire fiction that followed, with Nosferatu even being a specific class of vampire in the World of Darkness RPG series. A reason why the character of Orlok became such a cult icon that this 100-year-old creation appears as a gag ending in an episode of SpongeBob of all things. It's left such a legacy that its DNA can be felt in almost everything that followed, and that DNA isn't going away anytime soon. It and Caligari are at the very top of the horror family tree, and every movie that's ever evoked dread, shown a person's face contorted with fear, spooked you with atmosphere and tension, or given you nightmares are just the branches that feed down to them. So the next time something scares you so much you can't sleep, you know who to blame. Nosferatu! Well then, that was quite the little horror history lesson, and with that marks the end of yet another episode of the final Wholesome Halloween video essay marathon. So once again, that's all I have time for today, but just a quick reminder before you go, this month's Wholesome Halloween is being carried out in aid of Trans Lifeline. So if you'd like to make a donation to them, you can do so with the donate button somewhere on this page. And obviously, I'll also be giving any ad revenue, Patreon money, and shirt sale profits, links to buy in the description, for this month to the charity as well. And once again, in other non-charity news, In Search of Darkness, the Fangoria-nominated documentary series that dove into 80s horror, has its first 90s entry coming up, and I am a credited advisor on it. So if you fancy picking up the latest entry in this incredible horror franchise, you can get a cheeky little discount code that gets you 10% off in the description. And if you buy through this code, not only will you get a sweet ass doc on an underexplored period of horror, you'll also be supporting yours truly. And speaking of supporting me, I'm also running to be this year's Face of Horror. October's a busy year for a skeleton. If you'd like to help me win the 2023 Face of Horror competition, then please vote for me at the link in the description. You get one free vote every single day, so remember to vote daily. And if you're so inclined, you can buy more votes to further assist me in the ranking if you wish. And doing so will aid the B Plus Foundation, which is a charity that helps fight childhood cancer. More info on that at the Face of Horror webpage, again in the description. Other than that, you know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe to my OnlyDans at the red button below. Hit the bell so you don't miss anything, and I will see you all again tomorrow.